So welcome everyone. My name is Anant Maringanti, and I'm from the Hyderabad Urban Lab. And this afternoon's two sessions, both of them focused on writing, are actually coming at the end of the PhD workshop here, but also at the beginning of a program that many of us are involved in, which is the program called Writing Urban India. And that's a program that was piloted in the middle of the lockdown and COVID. And now we are launching it in full earnest for the next 2 years. And we're going to be working with about 40 people in 2 cohorts of 20 each. So I'm very happy that kind of a conjuncture is here at this point. But I have to give you a little bit of a background to why we thought we should be doing this. Somewhere in 2019-20, we had begun to think about the problem of writing about urban India, both from the point of view of writing itself. How difficult is it to write in academic languages? What kind of discipline is it? What kind of a subjectivity is it, etc. Some part of it is an issue that is not specific to the urban. It's a problem with writing itself. How does one learn to write? How does one become a writer? But some of it was also about what are the avenues available for us? Where do you publish? How do you publish? How do you negotiate that space? Because one of the concerns is that are Indian urban scholars being seen enough in the international urban scholarship? If we are not, then why are we not being seen? Is it because we don't know what those conversations are? Is it because of lack of access to materials? Is it because we don't know the writing conventions? Is it because we're just not part of the conversations at all? What's going on? Right? So some of the basic understanding with which we started is that all writing is in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end, a social process. It's like joining a club, and people need to learn how to join the club. The club of book writers, the club of published authors, all of that. So what we are going to be doing is to be doing these 2 sessions, which are supported by the Urban Studies Journal and the Urban Studies Foundation, which is associated with that. Then the Indian Institute of Human Settlements itself. And then the larger network that we are calling Writing Urban India, which is anchored at Center for Policy Research. So that's the broad framework under which this is being done. And we hope to be doing many more of these programs, because we don't think that this is a question of just doing programs for some privileged few. How do we build a culture of writing? That's the challenge for us. So that's the quick introduction I wanted to make. The actual session itself is going to be handled by Gautam Bhan and Sushmita Pati, both of whom are published authors of books, and their books came out of their PhD projects. So that's one very, very specific pathway. How do you take your PhD and turn it into a book? What are the negotiations? What are the challenges? What goes on in that process? So that's what we're going to be hearing from them about. But at the last minute, Gautam told me that he's not going to be talking for 5 minutes and then ask for questions. He's going to possibly open it up for questions right in the beginning itself. Take care. It's up to you. Thank you so much for being here.
All right. So folks, welcome back. For all of you that have joined us online in the webinar format, welcome to you as well. It's wonderful to see nearly 170 people, which I hope will turn into 171 books, because one person will write 2. And I think it's also wonderful to have everyone in the room who's been with us in the next 3 days. So what we're going to do is just to Sushmita and I basically want to run this session led by your questions, okay? As opposed to being led by our own experiences. We will begin with a short introduction to our experience of writing and publishing. more so that you know that there are some specific questions better directed to us, right? So we've had experience with editors of certain kinds, published in certain ways. So we'll give you more topics that you may want to consider in terms of asking your questions. And then basically we'll try and answer as many of them collectively as possible. So those of you who are in the PhD workshop have a link, and at any point you can start putting in your questions to that link. Those of you who are in the webinar format, I'll ask you to wait until you see the shared screen with questions. If there are any questions that you want to ask that are not covered in that list, please use the Q&A box in the webinar Zoom format, not the chat, the Q&A box. And our team here will pick up the questions and move them to the list, and we'll answer them in turn, okay? So you guys can start thinking about those questions as we put them up, but let me start by just taking a few minutes to tell you a little bit about this specific part in the first of these two joint sessions. So the second session this afternoon talks about publishing in academic journals. So hold your questions about journal articles and academic journals till then. This specific session is about the idea of taking your dissertation and making it into a book. Okay? So the thing to focus on is to ask yourself what the difference is between writing a monograph text, something called a book, versus an article. What happens to an argument when it has to stretch and move across the length of a manuscript, as opposed to something more specific in terms of a journal? The second thing is to think about, some of you will have written your dissertation as a monograph. In the introduction, then 1 follows 2 follows 3. But some of you will have written articles that don't necessarily read that. How do you move from different types of dissertations to a book format? Is a book a single argument, almost like a sequentially read text or a novel? Or actually can each chapter have its own life? Most of us, let's admit it, when we read books, tend to read the introduction, then a chapter or 2 of our choice. It's a little hard to make it all the way through an academic book in one sitting. Sushmita's book is an exception, and she should talk about that. So thinking a little bit about the relationship of the parts to the whole, the chapter to the whole. Many of you in the PhD workshop have said, is this one argument? Is it 2? Is it 3? Can it be multiple? Right? There are questions of books versus edited volumes, right? And a discussion around how they fare in the academy. Think about those. For me, I want to offer 2 experiences that have been formative. One is that the first books I wrote were not academic books. They were books out of an academic practice outside the university. One was an edited volume on queer politics called Because I Have a Voice, Queer Politics in India. And it was published by Yoda Press, which is an independent academic press, independent press that does both academic fiction, poetry, and other kinds of work, but certainly not an academic press. My second book was also not an academic book, and it was work that came out of field-based research during a housing rights campaign. And I think that of the books, the one that I struggle with the most is actually the academic book I wrote, which came out of my dissertation. So I'm happy to also talk about the difference between writing with an academic press versus a different kind of press that doesn't call itself an academic press. The second thing I'd love to talk about is I fought very hard in my books to have accessible editions that were affordable for Indian audiences, which means I had long fights with academic publishers. All my books have come out in South Asia first and in the rest of the world later. All of them are priced in rupees and are not import editions. And these were things that I was very particular about. And it was not easy to do. So I'm happy to talk about rights. I'm happy to talk about contracts. I'm happy to talk about how to negotiate different ways with Indian and international publishers. And I think it's an important part. Publishing is also an industry. This is not just an intellectual enterprise. There are very real political economies. We've been talking about these and then what that means. And then I think the other thing that I want to offer is that there is a big difference between my dissertation and my book. And I think it's very important for those of you currently in doctoral workshops to sort of think a little bit about how overlapping your dissertation and your book are, and what the time period between them is. It is not necessary to immediately move, and sometimes it's impossible Mostly because it's very hard to look at your dissertation for a few months after you filed it. I couldn't read mine for at least 7. So, thinking a little bit about when you feel ready and what's the difference between the content of the dissertation and the content of the book. This will vary very widely depending on the kind of PhD program you're in, because some of you are in PhD programs where the dissertation is very structured by the regulations of your universities. For example, you may have a separate literature review chapter that's mandated, a chapter you would never put in that form in a book. So the question of how much change, is this 10% edit, refinement, top up? Is this 30%? Are you doing new field work? Do you bring in kinds of work? So where content shifts between the dissertation and the book? I'll tell you my experience. I filed my dissertation with an introduction that I did not agree with and that my committee did not agree with, but we both agreed that we did not agree with it, which was very good. I felt like I had to try it. It was an argument screaming from my data, but it was not the argument I wanted to make. But I also wanted to graduate and finish and move on with my life. So we agreed, me and my committee, that we would try it. We both agreed it didn't work. I filed, I passed, I moved on. And 7 months later, I changed the entire introduction because I realized what I actually wanted to do with the material. So while the body of the dissertation, the findings chapters are very similar, the introduction of my dissertation doesn't exist at all in my book. It became 150 words in the conclusion as a thing I once did. Even though when I was writing it, it felt like the only thing I did in life. So it can be quite possible to move a long way. So those are my experiences. And I'll turn over to Sushmita to give you a set of anchor points for hers. And then we will open up the screen, see your questions and start answering.
Firstly, thank you for inviting me to talk about, talk to this panel about how to convert your dissertation into a book. I'm freshly out of it. So I think what all the struggles and the confusions that I had are still very, very fresh in mind. So I'm more than happy to talk about that. So just like Gautam, I'd also talk a little bit about my own personal journey and what I had to negotiate with. So to begin with, I think I was very pleased with my dissertation. I was more than happy with what I had written. And that became my major challenge because I didn't know what to do with it, right? Because in my head, it was done and it was over and I'd submitted it and I gotten a degree out of it. Now I didn't know how to reopen that and to change. What do you change really, right? So that became my initial struggle. I would take my chapter, I would sit with it and then I'd think around with sentences and I spent several months doing just that without realizing that what I need to do is junk my PhD and start afresh, which I eventually came to. But after many, many months of just wasting my time around various PhD chapters and their drafts and their PhD draft, some 367, something like that, right? So, so that was my major, I think my mental block was to how do I then redraft it. You will often hear people say two things to you whenever there's a conversation about how do you make a dissertation into a book, would be two things, which is one would be that you need to lose your literature review, right? In a PhD, you're trying to convince your committee that you've read enough, you have gone through all the important debates and conversations that have happened in your field, and you are building, as in you're standing on the shoulders of the work that has already been done, right? So you need to lose that. That's one thing that you do. The other thing is that you need to find your own voice, and nobody really tells you what is this voice, right? Where do you get this voice from? So, and I don't think we can either also tell you the same thing as to where do you find your voice, because I think that is the journey of the book. That the process of writing it, you will at some point you'll make that switch where you've changed from being a PhD student to an author with a voice, and that shift will happen, and that's where the magic of the book writing process really is. It's daunting, it's difficult, it's extremely scary, but I also enjoyed that process a lot, precisely because of this, because I'll admit it, I don't enjoy writing journal articles, because I think it's very structured, it's very, you need to have an introduction, you need to have evidence, you need to have a conclusion, and it's very structured within those 10,000 words. You can't innovate too much, you can't experiment too much with your writing style. But in a book, you get that creative liberty. And that's where I think the journey of finding your voice really is. So look forward to it. Don't. So that would definitely be one important thing I would like to tell you beforehand, that it's scary, but you will also begin to enjoy that process when it all begins to unravel in itself, right? So then the book becomes its own thing, and you are just one. You're just trying to do something with the text that it's already becoming. Few more things. So one major difference also is that in PhD, you are trying to go with it. You're trying to go into one specific question. You go deeper, and you're trying to find that one, say, narrow literature gap that there is, and you want to fill that. Your book, you have to do just the opposite, you have to flip it, because nobody is reading your book for the narrow literature gap that you have filled. Your committee will read it, your supervisors will read it, your examiners will read it for that literature gap. Your readership will not read your book because you have filled some literature gap. They will read it because you have something important to say. So you will need to ask yourself 3 questions. Who is your audience? Again, I think a question that I think Gautam has already flagged. Second is, what is the important thing that your book is saying? Why should anybody pick it up and read it? So these are the 3 questions that you will need to answer for yourself, and then work around that. So, that's mostly it. I can
should say something about the editor.
Yeah, so I also took help from a professional editor to polish the final bits of my writing, and that hugely helped. I don't know if I want to talk about it now.
No, just to mention it in case someone is curious about that part.
Yeah, I was also hoping to talk about the writing itself, but maybe I think I can. I'm happy to talk about the editorial process. Also about how do you think of the narrative structure. So I'm more than happy to address those concerns.
So let's do this now. We'll share the screen up with the questions that are there now. If all of you can take a couple of minutes and put them in. And what we'll do is we'll begin answering them. And then in the middle, we'll also just throw in some inputs that we want to put at your discretion. So whenever you feel like adding something about the narrative. Typically, in the way we run these sessions before, the questions cover anything we could have imagined we wanted to say. I'm pretty sure it will do that now. So I will say now, apologies, we will not answer every question that goes up. We'll answer as many as we can in the time. So if we can just go ahead and share the screen and start looking. And reminder to folks in the webinar format, as you see the questions, give it a little bit of time to let the list populate. And if at some point, say in about 10 minutes from now, you feel an absence, throw it in the Q&A and we'll pick it up from there. Okay, so if you can just increase the size a little bit. So is it a good strategy to target non-academic publishers to reach a large leadership? Okay. And then there's another question around approaching a publisher with a full manuscript versus reaching out first, and who to approach. So maybe we'll cluster some of the questions on how one interacts with the publisher. So Suchita, do you want to talk about your experience with Cambridge?
Sure. Yeah. So about approaching, so Cambridge was the first publisher I approached. I didn't have to do a lot of moving around publishers. But I approached without a full manuscript. I figured that I would need some kind of a deadline, and I was just testing waters, whether anybody would be interested. And thankfully it worked out. So I actually approached without a full manuscript. I took time I was in the process and I asked for more time. And I then put in my manuscript. What they asked me was for an introduction and 3 finished chapters, which is what was sent for peer review. So they didn't peer review the entire work, but they took in a significant chunk, like I would say 70% of my book, and they put it in for peer review. So that was the process, but it is also not a bad idea, I would think, to approach publishers with a close to done manuscript, because then you have a higher chance and a faster process. Then your book also doesn't go down that black hole and then disappear, right? So this process worked for me.
Yeah.
But
some other advantage. So some publishers, so 2 types of contracting models exist. Some publishers peer review and contract for full manuscript, which means they will not contract before the whole manuscript has been seen. Others will do a conditional contract at what they call the book proposal stage. But then the final contract is conditional again on the review of the whole manuscript. So the full manuscript is reviewed very much like an academic peer review in both cases. The difference is in some places, you know who you're going with, you're contracted already. And in others, the contract comes only at the end of the peer review. Oxford University Press, for example, usually contracts at book proposal. So does Orient Black Swan, but many others, Routledge doesn't. It contracts at full peer review. So different publishers have different options about it. But either which way, so if you look at, so sample book proposal formats are actually easily available online. You can even write to the editors of academic presses saying, could you share a template? They're often happy to. Now, those book proposal formats are not introduction plus 3 chapters, but they're significant. You'll have to at least give 1 written introduction, and typically it's sometimes 1,000-word abstract per chapter. So basically, one rule of thumb is you have to be fairly close before you're talking to publishers. If you talk too early, you're not going to be able to give a substantive book proposal. You also have to have finished all your decisions about what's going in the book. So the book's content shouldn't be evolving when you talk to a publisher. You should be in the process of writing it down in some ways. Yeah. So that's one thing to think about it. There are pros and cons of having a contract in your hand at proposal stage. I think, like Sushmita said, I wanted the deadline. I wanted to only actually go when I was done, because I'm personally very impatient and I wanted the process of manuscript to publication to be short. And that helps if you have a full manuscript. So there's a little bit of those things that go up and down.
Just to clarify, Cambridge also gave the contract after the peer review.
The final contract will always come after final peer review. But some folks will give you a conditional contract at book proposal stage. So you can think through between those 2. If you think a little bit about how to approach, so let's link this up a little bit with the questions of also whether you should pick non-academic publishers, the question of who to pick. So I'll say 2 things on this. I think that it is important to take 2 factors in mind. One, you have a certain requirement for your own professional career. If you're early career scholars, if you're in a system that values an academic press book for promotion, for tenure, you have to take those considerations very seriously. Whether they are right or wrong is a debate that we can have until the cows come home, but you are in a system with real constraints. So you may want to publish with a non-academic publisher, but that will have consequences for your professional trajectory, and you must weigh them very responsibly. So one of the things also to remember is that you are scholars. You will not only write 1 text in your life. And so some of the non-academic books, the other forms of writing, can emerge as you become more secure in your career. Right? So it's also not to put all the weight to fulfill every mandate of your ethical and political intellectual life in your first book. I had an advisor who once told me that publishing an academic book is like buying your ticket to freedom. Do it, get it out of the way, and then write what you want. One way to think about it. So take the consideration seriously. Take also seriously your considerations about the audiences you want to reach, because the choice of being between academic and non-academic publishers will structure some of the way your book is peer reviewed, which means the question that Sushmita was saying about what kind of writing, you don't have to do a literature review chapter, but an academic text will be reviewed to speak to academic literature. The good thing is that even new academic books are getting a little less stodgy about what that means. There's much more creativity even within the university press academic book today. It's not, you don't have to write some heavy tome that has citations in every line, but you are answering to an academic review. And I think that's the balance you have to strike in terms of your tone and your register. I think that academic publishers, non-academic publishers certainly circulate more, but I want to make another real distinction. Independent non-academic publishers allow you great creativity, but you have to be very serious about their distribution, because independent presses aren't often capable of distributing. A Penguin is a non-academic press, and a small independent feminist press is also a non-academic press. There are big differences between their circulation. So these are considerations you should weigh between choosing academic and non-academic books. But again, it partly depends also on you. You may be getting a PhD, but entering into practice and are not interested in the tenure or academic trajectories of the university, in which case your choices are very different. So think about your professional trajectory. Think about the question of distribution. Think a little bit about the question of the constraints you will get in facing academic review versus fuller creativity in your narrative writing. And I'll park one thing for later, which is that remember that the book is not the only thing you're writing. You will, even if you're publishing an academic book, you are still writing outside, writing publicly, writing in other formats, writing in newspapers, writing journal articles. So it's also good to think of your writing as multi-format and not reduce yourself to your book. So you may make one decision for an academic book and then write 20 public pieces outside that in order to reach that audience. So think also about your audiences being reached by all of your writing, not only by your book. You want to add anything to this? Sure.
Covered pretty much everything.
So do you want to take
the time question?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, okay. So there are a couple of questions around how much time should you take after your submission to publish a book? Is the data getting old a concern? Yes, it's definitely a concern. Your field is changing. What is relevant today is not relevant 5 years down the line. But that also doesn't mean that it puts you in an anxiety and the fact that you have to think that you have to put your book out in 3 years. What usually I've seen is that most PhDs get converted into a book within an 5 to 8 year time frame. And that's decently a good time frame where your data, you can also go back and refresh your material and update what you've written towards the end. But it's not a case where your data is completely outdated and you have to do new research altogether. Anything beyond that period, I think gets your whole question may need to be relooked at, right? But between 5 to 8 years is something like a sweet spot. What if the terms of the debate have changed since your dissertation, which requires a different mode of writing? Says Longueuil history that an urban ethnography should Okay. So these are things that you will have to constantly. So these are not necessarily questions you're negotiating only at the end. You are negotiating how the question is changing as you're working on it. Right. So as I was working on my manuscript, I could see certain things have happened in the field, and how do I now make sense of it? So when I was writing, I also had to make those trips back to my field, get those concerns in. How towards the end, as I was finishing up, the pandemic hit, and the whole question again stood in a way had changed, right? So then those were things that came into my conclusion in my epilogue, where I'm not making final arguments about it, but I'm saying, okay, these are the challenges now, and this is how the field may shift. And I'm ending it there. So, but don't think of it in a way that you have to, that this is always in flux. You are also, as you're writing, you're constantly thinking about these changes. I would say that don't get too concerned with this, but do aim to finish your book within that 5 to 7 year kind of a frame, which is good enough.
Let me say this, and let me link this to another one of the questions, which is, why do it as a book instead of taking parts of the argument and distributing it across journal articles? Why not put it up and break it up? So I think there are, honestly, there's no right choice between those two formats. The idea is that your work is circulating and that it's getting out. What could be the difference? One difference I would suggest to you is this, and I think this answers the question of datedness as well. I think journal articles are much more time sensitive than books. So a journal article, has a kind of time where it's speaking to a moment in scholarship. The idea is that you typically would want to, if you think of your own citations, they may be seminal or classic or theoretical pieces that get cited for 10 years. But most journal articles get almost all of their citations within 3 years of publication. Right? And then your citations begin to drop. There are an exceptional set that we keep citing again and again and again and again, but those are a very small part. So if you think of the life of a journal article as being shorter, think about whether there are arguments you want from your work that have a much longer time frame, that actually the datedness, the empirical location is not so specific that if someone read it in 2015 versus 2018, the book doesn't do the same work. So I think that one way to intellectually separate a book from a set of articles is a book has a more abstracted, a more fundamental, a longer durée argument that is not going to become less relevant within a small historical time period, right? And that also tells you a little bit on why to write the book. A book allows you the freedom to say, look, I have this finding, these chapters, but above and beyond them, I'm saying something more fundamental, saying something about, so if you take the example of Sushmita's book, I'm saying something about the notion of rent creating the category of capital versus finance versus money, rent versus capital. These categorical debates are not going to suddenly go away in a 10-year period, right? They are. So when you have arguments, the book should hold arguments that are then fundamental to recurring questions for multiple forms of scholarship, right? So in the workshop, we've been using the word travel. When do your arguments travel? How do your questions travel? Books travel more than journal articles. Great journal articles also travel. I'm not setting that up, but great journal articles don't have to. It's perfectly good to write an excellent, focused journal article with a single point argument. It adds to knowledge, it moves us along. Books are meant to enter the debate at a slightly more philosophical level, a slightly deeper level of argument. This is the way I've always thought of them. So when think of yourself as readers. When you sit with a book, you want something from across its text. You want something bigger than what you expect from an article. Remember your experience as a reader when you imagine yourself as an author. Think of what you take from books and why certain books sit on your shelf and you keep going back to them. Think of books as holding that kind of weight of argument, right? Now, again, I'll remind you, you are professionals and you are a form of labor in an industry, which means that books also have different strategic importance in journal articles. This is changing very rapidly. When I was a doctoral student, the book was the gold standard. You could not even graduate unless you wrote a dissertation, which was a monograph length book. This is no longer true, including in my own department. So debates on making knowledge more agile, debates on getting knowledge more quicker, debates on putting it in multiple forms means books still play that role, but they also don't. So I think that many academic systems value journal articles as much as books. They're not separated, so they don't affect your professional trajectory as much. So I would definitely say that, you all are a generation of scholars that has more choice in deciding book versus journal articles. And I at least, I don't know, I don't see a compromise if you put your work out as journal articles at all. So I would not put them next to each other. I would ask which one you want to write and whether you feel like you have a book level argument that you need the book for. You don't feel satisfied when the journal articles are out. It's not enough. But at the same time, if you don't want to write the book, it's absolutely valid and right and correct and meaningful. It's not at all a compromise, which I think is a better way to think about it rather than think about it as a trade-off.
One thing to consider here would be, how is your dissertation structured. Sometimes your chapters can very well be standalone pieces, right? In that case, it's a perfectly good strategy to go in with, peer-reviewed journals. And like Gautam just mentioned, it's equally valid, right? But for example, in my case, I realized that there is an overarching narrative, there's an overarching story, which individual journal articles may not necessarily be able to do justice to if I don't tell that entire story. So for me, it became absolutely crucial to think about it in the form of a book. But it's perfectly valid and absolutely okay to come out with 5 journal articles out of your 5, say, PhD chapters.
So that's the 14. You structure your dissertation in a way that it could be converted into a book eventually. You can, but you can absolutely also not. And I think that's between your choices and the possibilities or departments and your universities allow. I will say that my advisors never let me call my text a dissertation. They said, you're writing a book, call it a book. So even when I was writing it, I always called it a book. And it really helped me actually write it as a book. But again, it was because they first asked me, I did my PhD in the US. They said, do you want a job in the American Academy? I said, no. Then they said, right, what you want. Okay. And that's, again, the reality of, if I had wanted a job in a particular academy, I have to be serious about the requirements of getting an assistant professor position. So we can't be naive about those constraints in the early parts of our career, but it does help in thinking about, at some point, look at your dissertation, call it a book, and see what changes in the flow, in the chapter structures, in the argument, in the tone. So at some point, you have to start thinking of it as a book. And that's an important switch to make mentally in your mind. At some point we're there. So do you want to take 15 before we go on? The editor question?
Yeah. So, okay. So yes, I did make use of a professional editor. I got someone professional to look at my manuscript end to end after I had done, after I was completely finished with it. There are 2 kinds of editing services available. One is called a developmental editing, and the other is, of course, the line editing and copy editing. What a developmental editor does is look at your entire manuscript and comment on the structure of it, whether the entire narrative arc is flowing, whether there is whether it needs to be restructured in some ways, whether so it's an overarching. So it's sometimes useful to hire them early on. What I went for is a line editor who went as in line by line as per of my page of my of my manuscript, and did some sort of a language edits, which was hugely useful because sometimes we are very prone to using arcane words which are repetitive, which are superfluous, which are not necessarily there. So we don't quite, as academic writers, and this is something that I think we all need to work on, is we don't understand the economy of our writing very well. We tend to use too many words to say something which can be said in 5 words, right? And it's useful to think of it like that. So I think a line editor helps in cutting those excess, right? And helps to make it more readable. So I do think that my book is far more readable precisely because of my editor's intervention. Are there monetary concerns involved? Of course it is. There is, and it is expensive. I wouldn't. So of course it's a luxury to be able to afford one. The charges could be anywhere between 1 rupees per word to 3 rupees per word, right? So depending on, so it can amount to, if you're writing 1 lakh words or 80,000 words, it is a significant chunk of money. So again, but it doesn't mean that everybody needs an editor always. You can think about how do you economize words, how do you, there are some great books out there which can be very, very useful. One is William Zelizer's book which is called Writing Well. I think that's what it's called. The other one is called Thinking Like an Editor. Right? So these two books, I think overarchingly will give you a sense of how editing really works. And much of writing is actually editing. You're writing far less than you're editing some 20 times more than that, right? So take that editing process very, very seriously, far more seriously than writing, because your writing is actually 80% editing. Right?
I would just emphasize that 5 times over. I actually think most of the work between the dissertation and the book is editing. It's not writing. And I think it's very important to think about that. And I just want to, I'm also smiling because I can see the IHS Word Lab sitting back cheering from the rafters in full agreement. And I want to just emphasize that I think the other thing outside professional editors, which I think is pivotal when you move from dissertation to book, you need a community of readers that you trust. You need an intimate community of readers that are not your friends, but are friendly. There's a big difference. So your friends are not your editors. There is a reason why cinematographers, cameramen, directors, and editors are 4 different professions. Because the same person who shoots the footage cannot edit the footage. And I think it's really important to have a set of readers who are your first. Everyone who's published a book, go to the acknowledgement sections and you will find their community of readers. Right? And they are people who are part of your imagined audience. Some of them are people who are not close to your disciplines, but are invested in your questions. There are people who may not be either, but are just sharp intellectual readers whose opinions and thinking you respect. So I think it's very important. Some of them will be cohort members in your departments. I'm hoping that after this workshop, you will be each other's readers. For some of you who share those, don't feel the need for your readers to be people who are of your discipline or interested in the same topic or in the same site. In fact, some of the best readers are adjacent to you empirically. They are not so close to your material. This is often also true of PhD committees, but that's another time. So I think it's an important way to think about that. First reading is absolutely essential. But these are people who are tough enough with you to be honest, but are also invested in your success, which means that critique is not a performative negativity. It is a constructive, solidarity-based critique. And I think the best of the academy is this kind of collegiality. So I would really invest time from now on, early in your PhD, to find your community of readers so that you imagine them when you think of the book. And then they are your first editors in a way. And I think that's a very, very, very pivotal. It's also about our own blind spots. And, if you have a book, we've been talking about interdisciplinarity for 3 days. If you have a book you want people from outside your discipline to read, your first readers must be like that. So they must say, that's not what I hear you saying when you say this. This jargon is only known to you. We've internalized a lot of our academic language in our discipline. We don't even use. So when academics say they're not using jargon, it means there's a 10% reduction and 90% of the jargon is still firmly in place, right? So the question really is that you need someone who really can call you out on that in a way that's constructive. So I would say, think of editing alongside this community of readers. Books need readers as they're being written, and then they need a different set of readers after they've been published. So I just wanted to add that point over there. So there's 2 questions here that I want to pick up. One is about academic publishers of repute to publish unaffordable editions, release world editions, and the rest of the questions there. And the one about, can you tell us more about publishing in different geographies, India versus other places in the world? I have a lot to say about this. Okay, so there are 2 things to understand importantly. The publishing world divides the world into what are called regions for rights. Okay, so rights are not automatically given globally. South Asia is a region. Sub-Saharan Africa is a region. Continental Europe is a distinct region from the UK. There are different divisions in how North and South America get split up, depending on which publisher you are. which means rights belong in geographically bounded regions. Right? Now, most of us don't know this, and it leads to an automatic default contract where you sign a contract, which we never read, just like the terms and conditions of every app you download. And you have automatically signed away your rights, A, globally, B, in perpetuity, and C, you've signed away e-rights along with your physical book rights. You've signed away translation rights along with your book rights. Right? So the four things to really pay attention to when you get a book contract. What is the geography of the rights being asked for? For how long are the rights with the publisher? Right? 3, what are the rights for who has the electronic rights, which are also divided by region? And 4, what are the terms for translation? And if some of you are writing really wonderful dissertations, filmography, cinema, there's all kinds of rights that come in. Now, what's important is to realize that if you have a publisher that has the world rights for your book, but does not publish in your region, right, does not have a domestic publication in your region, your book will be charged at a foreign currency rate. Okay, these rates used to be appalling. They are now reasonable. They've actually, even the foreign imprint rates have come down, but it's the difference between, 4,000 rupees to 1,500 rupees, but you're still not at 699 or 599, right? So what's in Oxford University Press, for example, publishes in India, which means if you sign with OUP India, you get South Asia rates. Okay? So don't assume that it is an international publisher only because it's called OUP. OUP is based in India as well, right? But Wiley Blackwell is not, right? So you have to know who has an office that prints and publishes here. So you will see a book at the bottom, it says for sale in the South Asian subcontinent only. That is a geography of rights, okay? So the rights have been in South Asia. You can absolutely tell your publishers that you do not want to give South Asia rights to your work. You can talk to academic publishers and offer them rights to other regions, except the region which is your home region. This is a negotiation. It's not a simple ask. It is not one that they will be like, sure, right? But more often than not, increasingly now they say yes. Okay? So when I was talking about my own book that came out of the dissertation, I almost signed contracts with 2 publishers and did not sign it because in the end, they refused to give South Asia rights to me for the book. And it was a non-negotiable thing for me. I said, no matter what happens. I signed eventually with Orient Black Swan for the South Asia rights. And then I signed with the University of Georgia Press for the international editions, who were very happy to have only rights in their regions. Okay? So this negotiation is one thing to think about. The one way to do it, if you want to be strategic, sign a South Asia contract first. So the reverse also applies. If you sign with the South Asian publisher, don't give them world rights either. Give them South Asia rights so that you hold the rights for the other regions and go to international publishers and say, South Asia is gone, they're publishing it. I have the rest of the rights to offer you in place. Same with e-rights and same with the physical print rights. I would urge, I would say, your ability to negotiate this is contingent on your privilege as an academic, your status in your own professional trajectory. It is, you may need a book more than you would like to defend rights. So I'm not giving an injunction. I think everyone has to take decisions based on how much they can afford to risk and what fights they fight. And that is individual to your own personal biography and history and your institution. But I would encourage you to at least explore this possibility very strongly. And I do want to say that publishers have become more and more open to it. I know several publishers now who will simply give you South Asia rights. The ones that you will struggle with are the ones who will say, but we'll print it in South Asia. We'll do a special South Asia edition. So there, just remember that instead of 30 pounds, it will become 15 pounds. 15 pounds is still 1,500 rupees, right? So you can come down with an India edition of a global book, but you will never come down to South Asia prices. And I think this is pivotal to understand. The second thing I want to be able to say is that I negotiated to get all the rights back to my book in 5 years. Now, this is a tougher negotiation. Basically, they were like, no, this is not possible. And I was like, why not? And then we fought for a long time and they agreed. there are now also precedences. And why? Because 95% of academic books have sold 95% of their total sales within 3 years. That is a fact of the publishing industry. Very few books continue to remain. The ones that do are the ones that are privileged enough to be photocopied. If your book is being photocopied, there is no greater compliment and no greater economic incentive because it keeps your book alive and in print. So I've never understood why academics are upset that people photocopy their books. I would pay people to photocopy my books if someone cared, because it keeps your book being read and it keeps your book in print. So most publishers actually beyond 3 years, this is now changing because digital editions can be sold over time indisposably, and print on demand has entered the publishing industry. So now a lot of publishers say, well, we may not be printing a print run, but print on demand. So we keep your rights because anyone can order the book and within 2 days, they'll print a single copy and send it. Because now new technology, you don't do a 500 copy print run anymore. You can print one book. This print on demand business is very tricky. And I don't think you should buy it because what you do is what you're taking back is called non-exclusive rights, which means it's not that your original publisher cannot still do print runs on your book. It's just that they are not the only ones allowed to print the book, which means other publishers can print your book and you can put it out fully in full text without any consequences. So I would say really think a little bit about these questions and really negotiate your contracts. Don't just sign them and ask these 4 questions of them very clearly.
I'll take the 2 questions on structure. How do you structure your dissertation that could be converted into a book? So of course, there is no formula to doing this. The way to think about it is whether you would like to structure your book temporally, right? So one way to do is, okay, what was it? So I'm sure all of our works have a certain kind of historical component. So whether we start from 1920s and then follow the story from there, or whether you would, whatever concept you're dealing with, whatever is your main idea, whether you would want to structure it by breaking parts of that argument into different chapters. For me, both these sort of overlap. The argument part as well as the temporal part sort of overlap in a way that it fell together within specific chapters, right? So that's one thing to think about in terms of structuring your chapters overall. One thing to remember is, so my PhD had 5 chapters, but my book has 7. And initially I thought, and it was a similar kind of a structure because that was also temporal as well as a conceptual format. And I thought that worked very nicely. But the only reason why I broke those 5 chapters into 7 is because all my chapters were close to 20,000 words. And this happens to probably a lot of us who are writing dissertations. We end up writing really, really long chapters, 18,000 words, 20,000 words, which is not necessarily the best way to go about when we are writing our books. Because again, in academics, I think our biggest problem is that we take our audience quite for granted. We are mostly dealing with captive audience, whether it's our classrooms or conferences. But when we're writing books, one thing we have to constantly think about is why should anybody pick it up and read it? So keeping short chapters is a good way of keeping people hooked on to your book chapter by chapter, right? So I had to cut that down into 12,000 words. Doing that, I realized was great for me because the chunk that came out and the 2 chapters that came out of it extra, it allowed a lot more breathing room to the arguments that I was making, which otherwise was getting, buried under that 20,000 bulk, right? So it allowed me to make more nuanced arguments, make nuanced observations, pull in some more, field work that was getting left out, So overarchingly, as in I was quite amazed to see how the book, now if you look at the book, you will not be able to tell which are those two chapters, right? Because it seems somewhat seamless. But it wasn't the case, right? I had to struggle to, earlier I was like, oh my God, what do I do? These are only 8,000 words. But the more I thought about it, they evolved into a life of their own. So that's one. I'd like to talk a little about the narrative structure also, because I was quite clear about it that it has to be for a general audience, even if it's a university press book. I'm not just writing for academics, I'm writing it for anyone who's interested in this phenomenon, right? So I tried something called the 3-act narrative structure, which is a very commonly talked of thing, a structure in fiction, right? Or in films. So any screenplay, that book that you read, or any kind of book which talks about fiction writing, you would see that they're talking about the 3-act structure. So what's the 3-act structure? You're talking about someone who's an average person who leads a regular life. In the 2nd act, something interesting happens to that person, something earth-shattering event takes place, and which forces the character to change, right? And in the 3rd act is the final resolution of that event. So think about any film, there is a 3-act structure, right? Think of Diva, think of Laksh, think of any piece of fiction that you've read recently. There is a 3-act structure, and people are doing different kinds of things to the 3-act structure, right? It's not the same. There's a lot of scope there. So I tried that. I'm not saying I did that very well, but having the 3-act structure, in some senses, or at least trying to make my work fit in that 3-act structure, I believe is again helping the narrative style of the book. So I did that overarchingly across my chapters, but I also did this specifically within chapters as well. So 2 chapters within the chapter itself, I played around with the 3-act structure, which is talking about some characters, some figures, some of my respondents who I spoke with, and how their lives are changing as land acquisition is happening, or something, or some kind of a business flops, or something else happens. So I tried that, and that could be a way of thinking about your book structure as well. But play around with, in fact, fiction and film. Screenplays are great places to learn about how do you tell a tight story, right? And then nobody is a better storyteller than some of the best fiction or some of the best films that we have seen. So it's a great place where we can also learn and imbibe some of that to whatever extent is possible.
No, that's lovely. I was also thinking that the 3-act process also describes your own life as you're writing the book. Act 2 is that drama, the 3rd is the resolution. On narrative, I'll say 2 things that are really useful for me. I have long held, and I say this to a lot of my students, that if you can't draw the argument of the book, you can't write it. And I don't mean draw, I can't draw to save my life, like not illustration, but the flow chart, to map it graphically and say, from here I go here, an arrow here, because the arrow forces you to say, how do I get from here to here? And the big thing in a book is that you have to get from here to here, not just within a chapter, but across the chapters, right? So your table of contents at some point should be a graphical flowchart. And those arrows have to hold meaning, right? What are your segues? How are you connecting from one to the other? What memory of chapter 1 do you need to read chapter 2? Because if the chapters are just sitting by themselves and there's no flow, and one of my teachers used to say, don't hold them hostage. Let them want to be on the same page, right? So you just force these chapters to sit next to each other. They have nothing to do with each other. So I think in terms of narrative, another structure could be to visually think about the flow and to diagram it out and really think, where are the arrows? What are the directions of argument? How does the loop close? Where did I start? Where did I end, right? So not just arrows that go linearly from one to the other, but some arrows must loop back. Where are the loop backs? Where are the threads that go back and forth? So I'm going to pick a couple of these here on publishing part of your dissertations as articles and then also making them books. So you absolutely can. 2 of the 5 chapters of my book were already published as journal articles. They were very similar. In the book, the pre-publication of the chapter is acknowledged. So you say a previous version of this work has appeared in Urban Studies, etc. Almost all journals will say yes to do this. There are some journals who do not allow it, or who say that you have to show us that the chapter is significantly different from the version in the journal. This is not always hard. The journal articles tend to have much tighter word limits than book chapters. So the journal article will usually be a part of the longer book chapter. Mine were nearly identical. They were changed only to fit the narrative of a different argument, but a large part of the middle remained the same. I did mine with Economic and Political Weekly. EPW has no problem with you using published EPW journals into a published academic manuscript. For this, it's a good thing if you're thinking of a book, please check the terms of submission of any journal you submit to. Those terms of submission will typically tell you terms of reuse. And the Urban Studies editors here can answer the question in the next session for Urban Studies as well, particularly if you're interested. I think that's really important. It's also important that just because you have something out as a book doesn't mean you can't take one part of it and put it in as a journal article as well. So remember, they have slightly different timelines. So if you take the 5 to 8 sweet spot that Sushmita is saying, you may have published a couple of journal articles in year 3 and year 4. So you're moving towards the book incrementally. And by 5, you submit it, it comes out by 7, like something like that, right? That's one way to think about it. So don't see them in competition, but do ask yourself, what is the relationship between the journal article and the chapter? Typically, one is a part of the other, if they're exactly the same, and make sure that you check with journals. But again, here, I feel like it's largely opening up, I think, in a middle place in many ways. I also want to pick up this idea of series, which is 24, right? This is one of a very good way in which publishing houses show you what they're interested in publishing in. So 2 things happen in series. One, typically a series has a separate commissioning editor who is an academic or another editor who's not a full-time employee of the press, right? So in that way, they get to take manuscripts and recommend them for publication to the press. Many books are part of series. If you go to an academic publisher's website, they will have a tab. They'll show you all their series. And those series will group books together. There's lots of advantages in publishing in a series. One is that it puts you with a set of other writers for marketing purposes. This is lovely, especially if you like these writers. 2, it makes you confident that you picked the right publisher, right? Because one of the other questions is, how do you know which is a good fit for you? One of the ideal principles for this could be publish where you read. Think about the critical books that you read. See where they published. Those are also possible homes for you, right? This is the same with journal articles. A very good rule in how to pick a good journal is try and publish where you read, because that already tells you that you found this work valuable. You know the journal publishes like this, so it gives you a way to select. It's not the only way to go, but I think it's an important principle that you can use. Series are very, very useful. Series also allow you, connecting to how do you meet publishers, series allow you to write to a series editor individually and say, you edit this series, would you take a pitch from me for a manuscript, right? You can approach them directly. Again, they are not an employee of the publishing house. You're not writing to info@cup.org. You're writing to a person on an email that they have put out so that you can do as a series editor. Many series editors' books at the back will have and say, interested in being part of the series, write to us at, right? And those are actually looked at quite carefully, because series editors look at them. So series are a very good way to pick out in those ways. I'm going to leave the questions on journal articles and reviews to the next session on journals. Do you want to pick something else?
I think most of them are answered. There is one question on
28
supervisors.
Yeah, want to do that?
So the question is, what degree will your supervisor be present in the entire process? Well, that's entirely up to the relationship that you have with your supervisor. But I would still be on the side to argue that you should probably keep it to the minimum, because this book is your own. You also have to As in, it takes a little bit of confidence to also step out of your supervisor's, I would say shadow also in some senses. And however great they are, I've benefited a lot from my supervisor, and I'm very, very indebted to him. But at the same time, it's absolutely crucial that we step out of their shadows and negotiate and navigate this process entirely on our own, and not just because our supervisor approves or disapproves of what we are writing. So it's always good to have a conversation, but then their approval and disapproval is what was the thesis, right? It's something that they approved of already. The book is yours, and it's great to be able to take ownership of that.
I would agree. And just because of the way the question was framed, professionally, it is not their obligation or responsibility once you graduate to review your book chapters. They are no longer your supervisor. So, just to remember that.
What does an average conversation with an academic publisher?
About money?
None.
None at all. What, I mean, just, Jenny, you want to come in on this? Yes, please. Yeah. Can someone hand Jenny a mic? Okay.
So maybe I'll just take that. So it's basically the question of royalty, and Gautam can add a little more. So it's about how much royalty you get. The average is about, I think, 10%.
Yeah.
I get 8%. So that's roughly about it. But you should know that you're not necessarily become wealthy because you've written a book with a university press. That's not going to happen. At max, you probably can hope that in 10 years you will, sort of the amount of money that you spent. For example, I spent some money in terms of editing services and everything. You'll hope to break even, and that's what I think you should be hoping for. But mostly, I think it's one way of looking at the book that you write books for readership. So in fact, just like Gautam was saying, that it's great that students are photocopying your book and circulating it amongst themselves, and that's how it's being read. We're not necessarily in that sense professional authors who depend on royalty for a livelihood. We're supposed to expect it to have a question outside.
So remember, the economic gains of the book are more in its impact of your professional trajectory within the university, because it becomes part of your assessment for tenure, for promotion, for evaluation, etc. But I'll let Jenny come in on this because I'm hoping she has something to say about money.
Just inspired me.
Yes.
It's working. You can hear.
So yes, I edited quite a few book series over the years, and so I've seen the sort of process from the other side of who accepts the reviews, overseeing the reviewers, and all that kind of stuff. And the money side of it is something that different series are different about. So if you're connected to a series that says into journal like Antipode and Niger or the Society, linked to publishing series, then I'd be a little bit more flexible on some of those things. And then I would say there's the non-immediate returns on book production that are important.
Yeah.
You should negotiate a bit about how you're going to manage the index.
Yeah.
Say the charges are for, charges that on the type of paper, whether you have pictures or not, that sort of thing. So it's a slightly longer process there. Maybe you can look for more resources in your institution to try and help become some of those things. Look to friends and neighbors, the family business sometimes. So so all those things are a little variable, but I agree very strongly that it's not a lot of things to do. You can switch things around a little bit. You can look at others who've had different deals. You can try and negotiate with your publishers. That's the behind international. So generally, I think 7 to 10% is pretty good. Get more sales and get more money. And then I just wanted to say, as someone who has a lot of review processes, that the review process is really a way to review the book.
Yes.
So, I mean, getting a professional editor is one thing. Getting a good friend who speaks English well, another thing. But
The review process, you'll get great comments from the reviewers. Take them very seriously because every reviewer is any reader. And so even if you get super pissed off about what they're saying and think they're the most horrible people on the planet for a while, you really have to take them seriously, and that will improve your book a lot. Often the series editor or the academic who's involved in the series or the publishing process could do quite a lot of work for you. So something to think about is how to produce a good quality English language text. And some publishers will give extra support to produce a good English language text if you ask for it. So I was working with Wiley Blackwell, who no longer are publishing general academic manuscripts. So just to ward you off from that front. But they had a policy of giving extra language support where needed, or again, find a friend. So I had a couple of other quick comments about that. So from my experience, the publishers are not so keen to pick up a regionally focused book if you've already given away the rights in that region. So just to come back to that little debate, I mean, I think it's a good idea to try and to get the rights, and I've never succeeded, had long arguments, never succeeded. So my books are hopelessly expensive and published in Europe. But what it might be is that international publishers could consider that the readers of your book are already covered. So who else is going to read a book on Indian cities? Ha ha. So they would assess that, they might assess that there's not enough audience outside if you've already given away the regional rights. And that held even for some French books published in French, which we wanted to translate, and they were not willing to republish them, although we've since moved that dial quite a bit. And then one quick point, when to publish a book in career terms. And I think I had a personally fairly strong view on this, having reviewed quite a lot of PhDs into book proposals, is that it's quite hard actually to be just put a kind of a baseline under the discussion today, that it's really quite difficult to see a PhD turn into a book. And I think we've heard from both of you how much work that involved. Yeah. And so strategically, it could be worth reflecting on when to bring forward your book effort. So the one suggestion is a bit like, I think, what both of you have done, which is a PhD plus some more work, a bit more work of some kind, editing, or often extra chapters, a new empirical study, something that extends it in a comparative study. The other thing is to wait a little bit. Yeah. And you publish quickly a lot of journal articles, because that's how you get a job. That's how you get your early career progression. When a book really super counts is when you want a senior job. So if you want a professorship, you need a book in our UK system anyway, and maybe here. So it's really important then to think about your next project after your PhD as the one that is going to really stand for what you believe in intellectually. And so it's often at that stage that the best books come forward. So it kind of depends on your career plans, where you are, what you're wanting to do. But you could, a book effort might just go amiss in an early career stage. It might. That is, you don't get a big credit for it for being a lecturer, but it's a massively important thing for being a professor. Okay, and then the final thing that you all made me think about is that, in fact, in the UK system, open access journal and book publishing is becoming really important. So if you're looking for that as a possible career move at some stage for postdoc or something else, then we would be looking for that open access. And the book publishing charge can be an issue. So again, applying for bursaries, applying for scholarships, looking for fee waivers. So UCL Press, for example, has a number of fee waivers for low and middle income scholars publishing open access and so on. So there's a lot of many things to think about, and I have personally really enjoyed the discussion, so thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks so much for those. I want to just add a couple of things that struck me just from what Jenny was also saying, is that, I do think that book reviews, I don't know, Sushmita, what your experience was. I find book reviews to be a little different from journal article reviews. Also because remember, the person who's reviewing your book has spent time to read a whole manuscript. So they do, I have at least found, and the ones that I got, one of them struggled with the book. But I found it, like Jenny was saying, very, very generative, because if someone has taken the effort to read your whole manuscript, typically the review has effort in it, whether or not you like it or not. They don't tend to be scant, which I think is important. So I do think the review process is important, but to pick up on one of the questions here on 28, 29 on challenging reviewers, reviewers are to be responded to. They are not edicts. You don't have to agree with everything. You also, I think sometimes we sort of panic when reviews come in and say, well, how am I going to respond to this? And I have to respond to every single point. You can absolutely disagree. It is, especially in a book manuscript, you can absolutely, and that's why the editor at the publishing house is a very important space. You are, especially now, writing a book as a scholar. You have a point of view. And one of the very lovely things my committee said to me when I finished my PhD qualifying exams is they said to me, well, from now on, we'll tell you what you think, but it's up to you. And I was like, what do you mean, don't abandon me? You know, like, and no, you're a candidate, which means at this point, you decide what you can live with and not. We are now readers and we can offer you critiques, but every author has a right to take certain critiques and take certain positions. And what's important is that you know you're doing that. I feel the same way with reviewers. So I absolutely disagreed with reviewers. I think it's important. You can absolutely do so even as an earlier career scholar. I would encourage you to do so in journal article reviews as well. Not in order to say, I don't agree with you, this is illegitimate, but to say, I understand this, but this is the decision I have taken. This is the position I have on this. These are the things there. And I think it's important to do that. So I think a lot of the times, sometimes, and this I think goes back to a point I do want to make, which is that there are very real power hierarchies in the academic publishing world when you engage as a, let's take, because we're here in Bangalore, as a South Asian scholar with international presses. And so the question of who decides a book is a regional book versus a global book, to me is one of the reasons why I have withdrawn from conversations with scholars, because a book on Baltimore is not considered a regional book, but a book on Bangalore is considered a regional book. I find this absurd. Right? And I have had interactions with multiple journals where they're saying, well, we can't do a special issue from Bangalore because it's really particular, you know? And I was like, here is your special issue on London. Here is your 18th special issue on New York. Here's one on Paris, here's Tokyo. And now, of course, Shanghai, Dubai also get special issues. So there is a hierarchy you're walking into, and I think we have to be very straight about it. And if you're publishing with international publishers, they look at the world in a certain way, and they think that you are a region. And as one of my teachers used to say, the Middle East is middle of what and east of where. Okay? So I think it's important to think a little bit about those hierarchies and anticipate them. Whether you challenge them or not, I would again say, take a stock of your position. Not everyone can afford to take risks. It takes an enormous amount of privilege of different kinds. And you can do it in different times in your career. But I do think, but I will second what Jenny said. I mean, it's the first fight I had, I did not win, I withdrew. Right? So there are consequences. It's not an easy fight to pick. But I was very clear that signing that contract was non-negotiable for me. Right? And I did find publishers in a home for the book. So I think it's really a little bit of mix of the political economy of your life and the values that you hold. But the evaluations are not frictionless across an even playing field in the pursuit of knowledge. They are deeply structured in power hierarchies. And this is true of journals and it is true of books. And it is true, by the way, just so that we don't spend time global north bashing, of the way metropolitan Indian presses evaluate books written out of non-metropolitan Indian cities. This is as much a story of scales of, power hierarchies within India, within language, within geography. And I think it's an important thing to realize. So I think it's important to anticipate those kinds of readings of your work and have language. So like Divya said to you in the morning about methods, have your defenses ready. I would say the same thing about reviews. Have your defenses ready and claim that you have a right to write theory from everywhere. But also know that some editors will not agree with you and say, this is a regional book, which I think is always an interesting comment, but it's one that you have to think about.
Just to add to what Gautam said, I totally agree with what he said. I benefited immensely from my two reviewers who reviewed the first draft of the manuscript. And they had some valuable suggestions, which took me quite a while to rework and incorporate. But there will also be comments or suggestions to incorporate A, B, C, D, E literature or something else, which you need not necessarily find necessary. And just remember that what precisely what Gautam was also trying to was talking about, is that the conversation that you're having or the negotiation that you're having with the editors, with the reviewers, it is also coming from your own political position. So acknowledge that and be cognizant of the politics of scholarship that you are standing for, right? And what you will sort of give into and what is absolutely non-negotiable are things that you will have to negotiate from that position. And the comments that come in from the reviewer doesn't just end there, right? Once the book is out in public, there will be other readers of the book who would have A, B, C, D, E things to say about your work, right? And even then, how you sort of have that conversation with other readers as well is as important as the one that you're having with reviewers. So I think just take it in the longer stride of the life of the book that it will have and the kind of conversations that you will have along, right? Whether it is your peer reviewers, whether it is book reviewers at a later stage, or whether it's a general reader, these are conversations you will keep having, and peer reviewers are just one of them.
So I think we'll take just a few closing comments as we close on time. So I'll just take one, and then Sushmita, anything you'd like to add, not from the questions, but I think, so my apologies, because there's a few we couldn't get through, but I do want us to get half an hour off between sessions. So just a closing comment from me is a suggestion that was very useful in my structuring my own work, in binding the way empirical archives and arguments flow between books and dissertations. So if you take a 2x2 table, okay, so 4 boxes, I think it's a very useful thing to quickly sketch out for yourself, right? And if you think of a very simple set of 4 boxes, and in the top left box, you put your dissertation, okay? So you put everything that goes into the dissertation. In the top right box, you put the book, right? In the bottom left box, you put your journal articles. And in the bottom right box, you put other forms of writing. One way to think about dealing with all the stuff that you collect, all the fieldwork, all the constraints, everything, is to really say this part goes in this box, but I'm going to save this argument for the book, right? So you move things between the 2 boxes. It gives you a way to say, it's also a very good way to bind your dissertation, because if you keep trying to put everything into your dissertation, it's not just that it takes a long time, you don't finish, it's that the dissertation loses clarity because it's drowning in information to the point that you yourself can't wade through it. But the problem is we are all very wedded to our data. I mean, if I did that interview and there's that really nice line, how can I not write it? So give it a home, just give it a home in another box, okay? And some of them will go into your book. So it could say, actually, there's a larger argument here, but I don't want to go there. And maybe in the book, I'll go that direction and think broadly and talk about this theory. In the bottom left, you may have a journal article based on a particular part of your field work that's not even in your dissertation, right? You may have gone to study female domestic migrant workers and realize there's a whole thing about Kolkata's transportation economy you have something to say about, but you don't want to write about the transportation in the dissertation. Write a freestanding journal article one time, take the work, put it up, forget about it, right? So one way to do is to say, the rule is if you put something in one box, it cannot leak into the other boxes. These are not Venn diagrams, right? So if it's in the dissertation and not supposed to be in the book, leave it out, right? If it's in a journal article, you put it out, let it go. Then don't even write those 3 extra paragraphs and say, I've also written this article on transportation, even though my dissertation is about female domestic workers. Not in this box. And that last bottom right box is the most crucial one for me, which is that there's lots of things that you want to put somewhere that don't fit the mold of journal, article, book. Write in that box. Write op-eds in newspapers, write letters to your friends, journal in your diary, tell your friends about what your work is. Give that instinct, that knowledge, that experience, put field notes in it. Write it somewhere so it gets out of you and doesn't leak back into your draft, making it wieldy. Okay? Give it a place so that you feel that all the pearls of wisdom that you collected all were accounted for fully. But don't let the boxes leak into each other, because that's when each of them holds And then what happens is you gesture to them and don't even write about them fully. So neither do I understand the transport argument in the dissertation, and then I'm distracted from the story of migrant domestic workers, right? So the 4-box rule is a nice way to divide what's in the book and what's in the dissertation. It also means when you finish the dissertation, you already know at least 3-4 things you want to do before the book comes out. And some of that time is there. Like some of the stuff will come, like Jenny was saying, new work, or Suchita was saying new work, sometime new theory, new arguments, moving the order around. But there are 5 things that you, the day you submit your dissertation, there are 5 things you already want to do to it, right? So all of that stuff goes in the book box, right? You get to it in the book box. You don't hold yourself back from finishing. Otherwise, the dissertation sort of confuses. So think a little bit about the 4-box rule. And my final word will be, you know, who's your audience? Who should read it? Why should they care up? The only questions to ask. But why you care about your own book is also a question you have to ask. Book writing is a difficult, glorious, painful, lonely, wonderful solidarity figure. It's everything. It's maddening. But it is also joyous if you care about your book. It is torture to write a long argument about something you're only mildly interested in, or you kind of did, and it's important to be honest about yourself. A dissertation is a credential to get a degree. Not everyone is in love with the dissertations. Great, go find the next thing you want to work on, and also allow yourself a relationship with your work where you moved on to practice, you've moved on to journalism, you're writing fiction novels, and you let the dissertation be and move on. So I think it's a really important thing to say. One shouldn't, especially if one is not constrained professionally, think that the book is a high altar of academic scholarship. It is not. Rigorous academic scholarship sits everywhere from letters to parchas or political marches to public writing to newspapers to journal articles to books. The book has no singular hegemonic claim on being somehow better or not. But books are an incredible place that hold arguments that have room to breathe, and that can take you into a place of learning. And I think if you're someone who has had that experience of a reader, you know what a book does that nothing else can do. So if you have that relationship with your work, everything else is worth it if you really care about the book you're writing about. So the one great freedom to not have a committee or supervisor or degree is you get to write your book, right? So what Sushmita said, I will repeat again. This is now about you, right? And really owning that space makes the writing process quite glorious. Then the third act is a happy ending and not an art film where you're like, what happened to me and to this book and to everything else? So I will leave you with that and my best wishes for all your writing.
Again, to reiterate a few things that have already been mentioned, I think, yeah, it is an arduous process. It is hard. It is frustrating. And it's very, very anxiety inducing. It is all of that. You'll spend nights and days staring at the ceiling, wondering what are you doing with your life? All of that you will go through. But at the end of the day, I think now that I'm past it, now that the book is done, I do feel like, and it doesn't sound like anything that I've written before. And that's precisely because I went through this whole journey of rewriting and reordering what I had already said before in my dissertation. And I think and now that I'm sort of writing for other things, I'm realizing how the way I write and how I'm writing has changed. And that's because in some senses, the book, going through that entire process has given me the confidence that I did not have before I had done that, right? And of course, it's a solitary process, but make it into a communal process, make it into a process that you share with other friends, with other colleagues, build that sense of solidarity around each other's works, which is productive, which is constructive. I have benefited immensely from the kind of feedback that my friends gave. During pandemic, the only thing that could make me write were these online writing groups that we had across different cities and time zones. That was the only thing that I would look forward to in an entire week of depressing news. But I would wait for other people's draft, my friends' drafts to arrive and to meet and to discuss what we are working on, because that was one place of solace in some senses, and build those. And I think there was a question saying that these are hard to find. Yeah. These are hard to find, but if you look little close enough, you will find those communities. And these could, of course, be your colleagues. It could also be someone who, it could be your parents. It could be your partner. For example, my partner would take my drafts and read them and say, "What are you? I don't understand anything you did." And him telling me that again and again and again did break down my. It pushed me to make it more accessible, and I'm absolutely grateful for those interventions as well. So just someone telling you, again, what Gautam was already mentioning, is someone telling you that I don't get this. When you tell me, I understand it, right? And it's a fascinating story. But when you write it, I don't. So those comments are very, very useful, and they make you angry, and sometimes you also get mad. But if you take those seriously, they really help your writing and help you to communicate better. So yeah, on that note, all the best, and hope to read your books in maybe 5 to 8 years.
Thank you all very much. Just a note for everybody in the room and online, it's 4 p.m. India time, and we'll take a 30-minute break. And the second session on specifically more on journal articles, and with our speakers will start at 4:30, so 30 minutes from now. And for those of you online, it's on the same link. And so you can just mute and turn off for a bit or rejoin right at 4:30. Yeah, so either of them works. So thank you all very much for your time. Thank you all everyone who attended, and see you in 30 minutes.